The Sunday dinner was Renata's idea. That should have been my first warning. My sister-in-law, married to my husband's brother Cliff, had never once voluntarily hosted a family gathering in the 11 years she'd been part of the Hargrove orbit. She didn't cook. She didn't set tables. She didn't make small talk unless there was something in it for her. So when the invitation arrived, an actual paper invitation, cream cardstock with a gold foil border, addressed to the Hargrove family, I held it in my hands for a long moment before I set it down on the kitchen counter. My daughter, Lily, who had just turned 9, looked up from her homework. "What's that?" "Aunt Renata is having a dinner party." She wrinkled her nose. "Is she going to make that weird dip again?" "Probably." I tucked the invitation under a magnet on the fridge. "We'll eat before we go." The dinner was scheduled for the third Sunday in October, at Cliff and Renata's house in Fairview Heights, the 5-bedroom colonial they'd bought partly with money my mother-in-law, Dottie, had given them. A gift, Dottie called it. A loan with no paperwork and no expectation of repayment, which meant it was never a loan at all. I had watched that transfer happen 2 years earlier and said nothing. I was still in the habit, back then, of saying nothing. Lily and I arrived at 6:15. My husband Joel was traveling for work, a conference in Portland he couldn't reschedule, and I'd told him about the dinner only briefly, the way I mentioned things I didn't expect to matter. I didn't tell him what I was carrying into that house in my chest: 12 months of paperwork, 8 months of a draft email sitting unsent in my outbox, and a phone call I had not yet made. I was waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for exactly. I told myself I'd know it when it arrived. The driveway already held 4 cars when I pulled in: Dottie's silver sedan, Cliff's truck, a rental I didn't recognize, and a dark green SUV that belonged to Renata's mother, Beverly, a woman who traveled 3 states to attend any event where she believed her daughter deserved an audience. Inside, the house smelled like a candle trying to approximate a fall forest, something synthetic and aggressive. The dining table was extended to its full length and set with place cards. Place cards. At a family dinner, I found mine between Beverly and Dottie's youngest sister, Aunt Carol, who was 71 and profoundly hard of hearing, and could be counted on to follow no conversation without her hearing aids, which she routinely forgot. Lily's card was at the far end, between 2 of Cliff's cousins' kids she'd never met. She glanced at it, then up at me. "It's okay," I said quietly. "You can move it. I'll stay." She pulled out her chair and sat down with the particular dignity of a 9-year-old who has learned, from watching her mother, not to make scenes in other people's houses. I loved her so much it was sometimes hard to breathe. Renata emerged from the kitchen wearing a linen apron that had clearly never been used before, the fold creases still visible. She'd had her hair blown out. She was performing for someone, and I scanned the room until I found who. Standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of red wine, was a man I recognized from photographs but had never met in person. Renata's brother, Dominic. He was visiting from Toronto, allegedly, though I'd heard through Dottie that the visit had been planned for several weeks. He was an estate attorney. Renata had mentioned this at least 4 times in the past year, always in context that felt pointed. "Nora," Renata swept over and air-kissed the space beside my cheek. "You look tired." "Did you drive from the city?" "From Claremont, same as always." "Right, right." She was already looking past me. "Is Joel parking?" "Joel couldn't make it. Conference." Something moved across her face, not disappointment exactly, more like a recalculation. "Oh, what a shame. Well, we'll fill him in later." "Fill him in?" I filed that phrase without reacting. Dinner took its time assembling. There were olives and cheese, wine poured generously, Cliff's cousins arriving in stages with loud greetings, and the performative chaos of people who mistake volume for warmth. I accepted a glass of sparkling water and sat with Dottie for a while, listening to her talk about her garden and her bad knee and her neighbor's new fence, which she found personally offensive. Dottie was not a bad person. She was, in the taxonomy of family dynamics, a passenger, someone who moved in whatever direction the vehicle was already traveling, without ever thinking to look out the window and ask where they were going. She had enabled Renata for 11 years not from malice, but from exhaustion and a deep-seated belief that keeping peace and maintaining peace were the same thing. They were not. But I had stopped expecting Dottie to understand that distinction. "You're quiet tonight," Dottie observed. "I'm always quiet at dinners." "You're quieter than usual." She patted my hand. "Is everything all right with you and Joel?" "Everything is fine, Dottie." She didn't look entirely convinced, but she let it go, which was also her nature. Dinner was served in 2 rounds, a butternut squash soup that was actually quite good, because Renata had ordered it from a catering company and simply transferred it to her own pot, and then a roast that arrived at the table slightly overdone. Dominic made a toast that was genial and slightly too long. Beverly laughed at everything her son said. The cousins discussed a property dispute in a tone that suggested it was an argument they'd been having for years. Lily, at the far end, ate quietly, and shared a whispered conversation with the youngest cousin's kid, a boy named Theo who appeared to be around her age and was showing her something on a tablet. I watched her and felt the tightness in my chest settle into something more purposeful, something that knew what it was doing. It was during the second round of wine that Renata cleared her throat. Not a polite clearing, a theatrical one, the kind that signals intent. I actually wanted to share some news, she announced, touching the stem of her glass without lifting it. With the whole family here, it felt like the right time. Cliff, beside her, wore the expression of a man who has been briefed on an announcement but still isn't sure how he feels about it. He looked at the table. Cliff and I have made a decision about the lake house. There it was. The lake house was my mother-in-law's property, a three-bedroom cottage on Lake Caldwell that had been in the Hargrove family for 31 years. Dottie had inherited it from her own mother and had always spoken of it as something that belonged to all of them, the whole family, in the plural and communal sense. There was no formal will addressing it, there was no trust. There was, as I had discovered 14 months ago when I began quietly consulting an attorney of my own, effectively no legal instrument of any kind dictating what happened to that property when Dottie was gone. What there was, however, was a deed. And on that deed, one name had been added, 18 months prior, in a transaction I had not been informed of and that Joel had not been asked about. Renata's. Through a quitclaim deed that Dottie had signed, under circumstances I had spent 8 months documenting, the lake house had been transferred 50% to Renata Carroll Hargrove. We've decided to sell, Renata said. The table processed this at different speeds. Beverly nodded immediately because she already knew. The cousins exchanged glances. Aunt Carol, without her hearing aids, continued eating her roast with peaceful unawareness. Dottie's expression shifted in a way that I had never seen before, not grief, not protest. Something more like the face of a person who has agreed to something they did not fully understand and is now watching the consequences arrive. Renata, Dottie began. Mom, we talked about this. The upkeep alone is nearly 20,000 a year. It doesn't make financial sense to hold it. It's been in the family since, and the family can use the proceeds from the sale. Renata's voice was smooth, the tone of someone who has rehearsed this exact conversation. Cliff and I have already spoken to a realtor. We have an offer. A very good offer. How much? One of the cousins asked. 850,000. Renata said it the way people say numbers they are proud of, which, after fees, would be divided among the family. Divided how? The question came from me. The table turned. Renata met my eyes, and in that moment I saw what the place cards and the paper invitation and the blown-out hair had always been pointing toward. She had staged this. She had assembled an audience she believed would go along with her, seated the one person who might not at the end farthest from her, and arranged for Joel, the one Hargrove sibling who would have asked hard questions, to be absent. She had planned this. She had planned it well. Well, Renata said with a careful smile, given that the property has been partially transferred to me, which was your mother-in-law's decision, freely made, Cliff and I would receive our portion, and the remainder would be distributed among the other family members. What portion specifically? A pause, brief but instructive. 60%. Aunt Carol looked up suddenly as if she had heard something through vibration alone. Then she went back to her food. 60%, I repeated, keeping my voice the temperature of tap water, of 850,000, on a property that's been in Dottie's family for 31 years, that Dottie never agreed to sell. I did agree, Dottie started, to the transfer, Mom. Not to the sale. I looked at her directly. Did anyone ask you if you wanted to sell the lake house? Dottie's mouth opened. She looked at Renata. She looked at Cliff. Cliff studied his fork. We're not doing this tonight, Renata said, the smile compressing into something thinner. This is a family dinner, not a. You made it a business meeting when you seated us with place cards and brought your estate attorney brother. Dominic, to his credit, looked slightly uncomfortable. He set down his wine. Nora. Renata's voice carried the particular warning of a woman who expected to control the register of every room she entered. I understand this is a surprise. It isn't actually. That stopped her. I reached for my bag. I had not planned to do this here. Or perhaps I had, somewhere underneath the planning, in the part of me that had agreed to attend this dinner at all. I pulled out my phone and I stepped away from the table, just far enough that my voice wouldn't carry to Lily. I called my attorney. Her name was Bridget Osai, and she had been expecting my call for 8 months. When she picked up, I said 3 words. Move it up, she understood. We had discussed every possible version of this moment. I'll file first thing Monday, she said. And Nora, you have everything you need. I did. I had the quitclaim deed with Dottie's signature on it, and beside it, a neurologist's report dated 5 weeks before that signing, indicating that Dottie had been assessed for early-stage cognitive decline and advised not to make significant financial decisions without a trusted advocate present. No advocate had been present. The transaction had been handled by a notary Renata had sourced herself. I had 18 months of documentation. I had a forensic handwriting analysis. I had, most crucially, a conservation easement that my own attorney had discovered on the Lake Caldwell property, a restriction filed with the county in 1994 that prohibited residential resale without approval from a preservation board that had not met in 11 years and currently had no active members. Renata could not sell that property. Not to any buyer offering 850,000 or any other number. The deed transfer she had engineered was legally fragile. The sale she had announced tonight was not, in any binding sense, real. I returned to the table. Renata was speaking something reassuring, something about how this was just a conversation, how nothing was decided yet, how everyone's feelings were valid. The cousins were nodding. Beverly was nodding harder. Dottie was very still. I sat down. I've just asked my attorney to file a petition with the court, I said, calm, quiet, completely irreversible, challenging the validity of the quitclaim transfer, on the grounds that Dottie lacked the documented capacity to consent to a major property transaction at the time of signing. We'll also be notifying the County Preservation Board that the property is being offered for sale in potential violation of its conservation easement. Nobody moved. Then Lily, from the far end of the table without looking up from her plate, "Mom, can I have more water?" "Of course, sweetheart." I poured it for her. My hand was completely steady. Renata's face, in my peripheral vision, had stopped performing entirely. What was underneath the performance was not something I had ever seen before, because she had never before been in a room where someone had taken the architecture she'd built and shown her the cracks. The dinner did not survive the next 10 minutes. It simply stopped being a dinner and became something else, an unfinished sentence that no one knew how to end. I left with Lily at 8 o'clock. Lily buckled her seatbelt and then looked at me. Aunt Renata looked really mad. She did. "Are you in trouble?" "No." I pulled out of the driveway. "I'm just getting started." The momentum of what I'd set in motion did not feel abstract anymore. It felt like something physical, like a door I had finally, irrevocably walked through. Behind me, a family gathering slowly dismantled itself. Ahead of me, a Monday morning and a courthouse filing, and 11 years of patience arriving at their destination. I drove home with the windows cracked and the radio off, and the particular clarity of a person who has stopped waiting. The call from Bridget came at 8:47 on Monday morning. "Filed," she said. "Petition to void the transfer is with the probate court. We've also sent formal notice to the county land office regarding the easement restriction." Renata's realtor runs a proper title search, which they absolutely will before any closing. They're going to find it within the week. Good. Her attorney will contact us within 48 hours, maybe less. A pause. "You should also know the neurologist's report is strong. Her own physician documented the assessment. This wasn't someone we hired. This is Dottie's own medical file." "I know. I'd spent 3 weeks verifying that before I'd ever let Bridget put it in a filing." "How are you doing?" I looked out my kitchen window at the backyard. Lily's bicycle was leaning against the fence, still wearing the basket with the plastic flowers she'd put on it in June and refused to remove because, she said, flowers made things better and why would you argue with that? "I'm good," I said. "I'm genuinely good." "Then let's go get you a lake house." I'd spent the weeks between that dinner and the confrontation I knew was coming in a state of organized motion. Bridget had engaged a forensic document examiner to produce a report on the quitclaim transaction. The notary who had authenticated Dottie's signature was contacted by our investigator, and, when informed of the potential legal exposure of notarizing a document for an individual whose cognitive fitness was medically documented as compromised, agreed to provide a statement clarifying that she had not been informed of Dottie's condition at the time and would not have proceeded had she known. I called Dottie myself 2 weeks after the dinner, not to interrogate her, just to talk. I brought her coffee and sat with her in her sunroom, and I let her tell me, in her own time, about the afternoon Renata had come over with the paperwork. How Renata had explained it as a protection, a way of ensuring the property stayed in the family, she'd said, rather than being tied up in probate. How Dottie had trusted her. How Renata had been warm and reassuring and had brought a bottle of Dottie's favorite wine and had stayed for 3 hours. Did anyone explain what a quitclaim deed actually does? I asked her gently. Dottie thought about it. She said it was just a safety measure. "It transferred ownership, Dottie. 50% of the lake house is now legally in Renata's name. That's what you signed." She was quiet for a long time, then, "That wasn't what she told me." "I know. Would I be in trouble for signing it?" "No," I covered her hand with mine. "You were misled." "That's different." She cried a little quietly, the way old women sometimes cry, without escalation, without expectation of being fixed, just releasing something that had needed to go. I stayed until she was steady. What I didn't tell her yet was that her medical file, the neurologist's report documenting the cognitive assessment, had been obtained through a process I'd initiated with a healthcare attorney 9 months ago. It had taken careful steps. It had taken absolute discretion. Dottie didn't know I knew about the diagnosis. She didn't know I'd been building this case. She didn't know that the daughter-in-law she'd always considered the quiet one had been, for over a year, the most dangerous person in her family. Cliff reached out to Joel by phone the week after the dinner, and Joel called me the same evening, voice carefully neutral. "Do you want to tell me what's happening?" "Yes," I said. "Sit down." He sat. I told him everything. Not in the abbreviated version I'd been carrying alone for a year, the full version. Every document, every date, every step of what Renata had done and what I had done in response. He was quiet through most of it. When I finished, he said nothing for almost a full minute. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I needed to be sure before I said anything that couldn't be unsaid. And because I chose the next words carefully. I needed you to hear the proof, not the suspicion. I'd come to you with a theory you'd have wanted to give Renata the benefit of the doubt. Wouldn't you?" Another silence, longer. "Yeah," he said finally. "Probably. I know." He wasn't happy that I'd carried it alone, I understood that, but unhappy and wrong are not the same thing, and he understood that too, eventually. By the time Bridget set the meeting, Joel was not just informed, he was prepared. He'd read every document in the file. He had questions, good ones, and Bridget had answered them. The meeting was set for a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the petition was filed, at Bridget's offices in the Meridian building downtown. Renata had retained her own attorney, a man named Arthur Fenn, whose firm handled primarily civil disputes and who had, I suspected, been recommended by Dominic. I arrived 11 minutes early. Bridget was already there, her files arranged in precise columns, her reading glasses on her head. She looked up when I came in. "How are you sleeping?" "Perfectly," I said. She smiled. "Good." Joel arrived 2 minutes later, in a jacket and tie he'd worn without prompting. He kissed my cheek and sat beside me and didn't ask any unnecessary questions. Renata and Arthur Fenn arrived at exactly the scheduled time. Cliff was not with her. I noted that. She'd chosen to come without her husband, which told me something about the state of their agreement on how this should proceed. She looked, for the first time in 11 years of knowing her, like someone who had not slept well. Her foundation was impeccable. Her posture was architectural. But her eyes, when they found mine across the conference table, were doing something they hadn't done at the dinner. They were estimating. Arthur Fenn opened a folder and set it on the table with the practiced calm of a man billing by the hour. "We appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter before it proceeds further. Our client believes there are several significant mischaracterizations in the petition filing, and we'd like to. We have the notary's statement," Bridget said pleasantly. A pause, 2 seconds, exactly two. Renata's eyes moved to her attorney. "We're aware," Fenn said carefully, "that a statement has been obtained. However, a notary's retrospective account of their subjective impression does not. We also have the neurological assessment." Bridget slid a copy across the table. "Dated 5 weeks prior to the signing. Dottie's own physician, documenting moderate early-stage cognitive decline and an explicit recommendation against major financial decisions without an independent advocate." She let that land. The advocate Renata did not arrange. Renata's hand, which had been resting on the table beside her notepad, moved just slightly. She pressed her fingertips flat. "My client was not aware. She arranged the appointment with the notary herself," Bridget said. "The notary will testify to that." She also provided the referral to the notary from her personal network, not from anyone connected to Dottie, not from a family attorney, not from anyone who would have flagged the potential conflict. Renata sourced, scheduled, and supervised that transaction from beginning to end. Fenn turned a page in his folder. He was good, he didn't show much. But the turning was slightly too deliberate, the gesture of a man buying himself 2 seconds. "That's a characterization. There's also the easement," I said. Renata looked at me directly for the first time since she'd sat down. I met her gaze and kept my voice level. "The conservation easement filed in 1994, which prohibits residential resale without approval from a preservation board that is currently inactive. The buyer's title search found it on day 4, which is why they retracted their offer." I paused. "Did your realtor not tell you?" The color change happened gradually, which was worse somehow than if it had been sudden. A slow draining from her temples toward the center of her face, like water receding from sand. Her foundation, which had been flawless, now looked like a mask that had been placed over the wrong expression. "The offer was retracted." Her voice came out slightly higher than she'd intended. "4 days ago, Friday. I'm surprised they didn't reach out to you directly." I tilted my head, not unkindly. "Maybe they tried Cliff." She put her pen down. A small, controlled movement, but too deliberate, the action of someone preventing themselves from doing something else with their hands. Joel beside me said nothing. He had agreed the night before to let me lead. He watched Renata with the expression of a man revising a decade's worth of assumptions about someone he'd considered family. Arthur Fenn spoke to Renata in a low voice. She responded without looking at him. He nodded. "We'd like a short recess," he said. "Of course," Bridget said. They stepped into the hallway, the door closed. Bridget looked at me without speaking and gave a very small nod. Joel leaned toward me. "How long have you known about the easement?" 8 months. He exhaled through his nose, not quite a laugh. "You waited 8 months. I needed her to make the announcement, publicly, in front of witnesses." I straightened the edge of my notepad, which didn't need straightening. If I'd moved before she showed her hand, her attorney could have claimed it was a misunderstanding. That she never intended to actually sell, that the dinner conversation was just preliminary. I glanced at the door. Now there's a signed offer, a retracted buyer, a court filing, and 12 family witnesses to a specific, quantified 60-40 split, she proposed out loud. Joel was quiet for a moment. "Remind me never to be your opponent." "You never were." He reached over and covered my hand with his briefly, then took it away. That was enough. Renata and Fen returned in 9 minutes. She sat. She did not put her hands on the table this time. She kept them in her lap, and I could see, from the faint tension at her shoulders, that they were not entirely still there. Fen opened a different page. "Our client is willing to discuss a reversal of the deed transfer, contingent on an acknowledgement from all parties that the original intent was protective in nature and that no fraud was." "No," Bridget said. Fen looked up. "There will be no acknowledgement of intent that contradicts the documentary record." Bridget's voice was still pleasant. It was always pleasant. "Our petition already characterizes the transaction. If this goes to hearing, the medical record, the notary's statement, and the sourcing documentation go in front of a judge. Your client's intent will be characterized by those documents, not by language we negotiate today." She folded her hands. "What we are offering is a clean reversal of the deed, immediate withdrawal of the sale listing, a formal apology in writing to Dorothy Hargrove for the nature of the transaction, and no further action against your client, civil or otherwise." "Civil or otherwise," Fenn repeated slowly. "The notary's statement creates a potential exposure around the knowing exploitation of a cognitively vulnerable adult. I imagine you've reviewed the relevant statutes." Bridget gave him a moment with that. "Your client is not in a good position." Renata's composure, which was considerable, was doing what composure always does under sufficient pressure, not breaking, but developing hairline fractures visible only if you knew where to look. The line of her jaw, the too stillness of her throat, the way she was breathing slightly through her mouth rather than her nose. "I need to speak with my client privately," Fenn said. "Take all the time you need," Bridget said. They went out again. This time I looked at the window. The city below had the ordinary mid-morning busyness of a city that did not know or care what was happening in this room. Taxis, a food cart, someone walking a dog that was pulling hard towards something interesting. "She's going to take it," Joel said quietly. "I know. How do you feel?" I thought about it. My hands were in my lap, resting open, not gripping anything. The tightness I had carried in my sternum for 14 months was not entirely gone, but it had changed character. It wasn't the tightness of held breath anymore. It was something simpler, the feeling of standing still after a very long walk. "Ready," I said. They returned in 14 minutes. Renata sat down and looked at the table, and then, at last, she looked at me. Not the estimating look from before, not the performance from the dinner table. Something underneath those, something that was, I thought, the actual Renata stripped of the architecture. She looked tired. She looked, for the first time, like someone who had run out of rooms to move to. "Fine," she said, just that word. To me, not to the attorneys. Her voice cracked very slightly on the single syllable, not with grief but with effort, the sound of someone who has been holding a structure together for a long time and has just set it down. Fenn drafted the reversal agreement in consultation with Bridget that afternoon. The quitclaim deed transfer would be voided. The property would revert to Dottie's name, whole and without encumbrance, pending our separate agreement to establish a proper family trust with independent oversight. The sale listing was already dead on its own. The retracted offer had ensured that. The written apology was drafted by Fenn in careful, anodyne language and signed by Renata without visible protest, which told me more than anything else in that room had. It was 3:40 in the afternoon when the paperwork was complete. I walked out of the Meridian building into October sunlight, and I stood on the sidewalk and let myself breathe. Joel was beside me. He didn't say anything inspirational. He didn't make a speech. He said, "You want to get coffee?" And I said yes, and we walked to a place down the block and sat at a window table and drank our coffee and talked about ordinary things, Lily's upcoming school play, the roof on our house that needed attention, a podcast he'd been listening to. The ordinary texture of a life that was, now, no longer burdened by the thing it had been carrying. I did not tell him that, on the drive downtown that morning, I had felt, for the first time in over a year, no weight in my chest at all. I didn't need to say it. Some things are felt in the quiet between the words, and they don't require translation. The lake house came back to Dottie's name in full within 60 days of the filing. The family trust was established before Christmas, with an independent trustee and explicit provisions governing any future transfer or sale decisions, provisions that required the written consent of all adult Hargrove children, including Joel. Renata's name appears nowhere in it. The formal apology letter arrived by certified mail. Dottie read it alone in her sunroom and did not say much about it afterward, except once, briefly. I should have asked more questions. I told her she had trusted someone she loved, and that wasn't a failure of hers. She nodded and changed the subject, which was also her nature, and which I had grown to understand was not avoidance but a quiet form of survival. Cliff filed for legal separation in February, 4 months after the meeting. Whatever had broken between him and Renata during those weeks, whatever conversations they'd had about the dinner, the petition, the document Fenn had put in front of her to sign, I was not privy to it. What I know is that Cliff called Joel in January, and they had a conversation that lasted 2 hours, and when Joel came out of his home office afterward, his expression was complicated and private in the way that grief sometimes is. I didn't ask. He told me only that Cliff had known more than he'd let on, and that he was working through what that meant. Last I heard, Renata had moved into an apartment in a neighboring town. Five-bedroom colonial in Fairview Heights, the one bought with Dottie's money, with the cream-colored walls and the aggressive fall-scented candles, was part of the separation proceedings. She retained her position at the property management firm where she worked because none of what had happened was public beyond the family, and because I had not sought to expand the damage beyond what the situation required. I had wanted the lake house back. I had wanted Dottie protected. I had wanted the record corrected. Those things were accomplished. I didn't need her professionally ruined. That wasn't my point. Beverly stopped attending family gatherings. I noticed, and I did not mention it because not every absence requires commentary. Lily played the lead in her school's winter production, a version of a classic fairy tale, heavily edited by the drama teacher, in which the protagonist was a girl who solved her own problems through observation and patience. After the show in the school parking lot, Lily said, "Mom, did you think I was good? I thought you were extraordinary." She considered that. Ms. Fontaine said I was naturalistic. You are. She seemed satisfied with this and asked if we could get waffles, and we did, at a diner near the school that stayed open late on performance nights. We sat in a booth with sticky menus, and she got chocolate chip waffles and told me everything about the backstage drama among the fifth graders with the serious authority of someone reporting on matters of state. I sat across from her and listened and thought about nothing else in the world. The lake house is still there. We went in late June, all of us, Joel and Lily and me and Dottie, and a few of the cousins who'd had nothing to do with any of it. Lily learned to kayak. Dottie sat on the porch in the late afternoon and watched the water and said, more than once, that she was glad we were all there. On the last evening, after Lily was asleep in the room with the slanted ceiling that had always been the children's room, I sat on the dock with my feet in the water and watched the sky change color and felt nothing complicated at all. I don't carry anger about what Renata did. That would require giving her continued space in my interior life, which I have chosen, deliberately and without drama, not to do. She made a calculated decision about what I was worth and what she could take from the people I love. She was wrong. The record reflects that. That's sufficient. What I keep instead is the memory of Lily's voice in the car on the way home from that October dinner, small and steady and unimpressed, asking if I was in trouble, and my own voice answering, "No, I'm just getting started." It was true then. It is still true now. I got started and I finished it, and that is the whole story. So, did I wait too long to act, or was the timing exactly right? Tell me in the comments.